$75,000, sign it, take it, and disappear. Drew Vance slid the envelope across the conference table without looking up. His mother, Lorraine, sat beside him in a Chanel suit and a smile she hadn't bothered to hide since the moment Stella walked through the door. The attorney across the table clicked his pen twice, as though marking the official moment Stella Harmon's marriage had become a transaction. And in the hallway outside, visible through the frosted glass panel beside the door, Drew's girlfriend stood in a pale linen blazer, checking her phone, already wearing the earrings he'd bought her using money from the joint account Stella hadn't touched in 6 months. Everyone in that room expected Stella to cry. She didn't cry, she didn't beg, she didn't even flinch. Stella Harmon picked up the pen, looked at her husband, the way you look at something you've already decided you're done with, and she signed. If you're new here, welcome to Crimson Secrets. Please take a second to subscribe. This story is one you'll want to follow all the way to the end. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Stella had been awake since 4 in the morning. Not because she'd set an alarm. She hadn't set an alarm in 3 years. Sleep had become something she did, in short, careful increments, always aware of the particular silence of a house where the person sleeping beside her was no longer someone she recognized. She lay still for 12 minutes with her eyes open, watching the light from a passing car move slowly across the bedroom ceiling of the Chicago apartment they still technically shared. Drew was already gone. His side of the bed was cold and undisturbed in the way that told her he hadn't come home at all, which meant he'd spent the night at Brooke's. Brooke Tennyson, the daughter of Warren Tennyson, who ran one of the largest commercial real estate development firms in the Midwest, and who had been quietly circling Drew's architecture company for the better part of a year. Stella knew things about Drew Vance that Drew did not know she knew. That was the whole point. She got up. She made her own coffee in the kitchen, a plain drip maker, not the espresso machine Drew had bought to impress clients who came by for lunch. She stood at the counter in a gray pullover she'd owned for years and held the mug with both hands and looked out at the lake. Chicago at 5 in the morning in November was the color of charcoal and pewter, and it was the only version of the city that had ever felt entirely honest to her. She had made her decision 3 weeks ago. She was simply waiting for Drew to make his. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. James Alderton. She answered. "Everything is in place," he said. His voice was low, deliberate. He had been deliberate in everything for as long as she had known him, which was 22 years, since the summer she was 19. And her grandfather sat her down in his study and said, quietly, without ceremony, "When I am gone, James will be your first call. He is the most honest person in any room he enters." "Good," Stella said. "The board motion will be received and logged by 10 o'clock, James said. "Good." A pause. "How are you?" She considered the question seriously, the way he'd always asked it, not as a formality, but as an actual inquiry into her actual condition. "I'm fine," she said. "I think I've been fine for a while. I just hadn't let myself say it out loud." "Your grandfather would have had a few things to say about all of this." "He would have had exactly 4 words, Stella said, "and they would have been, 'I told you so.'" James made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You still want to do this quietly?" "I want to look him in the eye when he understands," she said. "Just that. That's all I want." "Understood," James said. "We'll be ready." She ended the call, finished her coffee, put on the coat she'd had for 4 years, a simple, navy wool, that Drew had once called too plain for the events they attended together. And she walked out of the apartment. The offices of Holt, Brennan and Cross occupied the 31st floor of a building on North Michigan Avenue, and Stella arrived 3 minutes before 10, which was exactly on time. The receptionist looked up when Stella stepped off the elevator, and for just a moment, there was something behind her professionally neutral expression, a flicker of something that looked like surprise. Stella had been told, early in her marriage, that she didn't look the way people expected. She'd never been entirely sure whether that was a compliment. "Mrs. Vance," the receptionist said. "Miss Harmon," Stella replied pleasantly, without heat. "Of course, right this way." She could hear Drew before the door opened. His voice carried in the particular way it did when he was performing confidence, a half-volume laugh, the clipped cadences of a man who expected to be listened to. She paused outside the conference room for exactly 2 seconds. What? Then she walked in. Drew sat at the head of the table with his attorney and a financial advisor she'd met once at a company dinner. He looked expensive. He always looked expensive. It was the one quality he'd cultivated with genuine discipline. He looked at Stella the way he'd been looking at her for the past year and a half, with the mild, slightly impatient expression of a man trying to close out a problem he'd expected to resolve more quickly. Lorraine Vance was seated to his left. No one had invited her. She had simply arrived, the way she always arrived, wherever she believed her presence would be most effective at diminishing someone. She looked at Stella the way she always had. Like Stella was a question she couldn't understand why Drew had ever bothered to ask. "You're late," Lorraine said. "I'm 3 minutes early," Stella replied, and sat down, not in the chair they'd positioned for her, slightly removed from the table, slightly smaller than the others. She pulled out the chair directly across from Drew. Drew's attorney cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harmon, we appreciate you coming in. The terms of the settlement." "I've read them," Stella said. The attorney blinked. "Of course." She looked at Drew. He met her gaze. He looked good, the way he always looked good, but there was something behind the surface that hadn't been there a year ago, a particular restlessness she recognized as the cost of maintaining a lie over a long period of time. Lying was expensive. She'd watched it spend him slowly. She had loved Drew Vance. That was the part that no one in this room would ever fully understand, because loving someone and being wrong about them were not the same thing, and did not cancel each other out. She had loved him in the first year, when he used to meet her for lunch on Tuesdays, because he said Tuesdays needed something to recommend them. She had loved him through the difficult months, when his firm nearly lost everything, and he sat at the kitchen table at midnight staring at his laptop screen, and she brought him tea without asking, without saying anything, just sat next to him while the fear moved through the room and eventually passed. She had loved him. He had looked at all of that and decided it was worth $75,000 in silence. She opened the envelope. She read every line of the settlement document. Drew shifted once in his chair. Lorraine's fingers tightened around her bag. The financial advisor studied the ceiling. "Drew," Stella said, setting the last page down. He leaned forward in the way he did when he wanted to end a conversation. "Stella, I know this is hard, but this is the right thing for both of us. You always said you wanted something simpler, something quieter." He spread his hand slightly. "Now you can have that." She looked at him for a moment. "Do you remember," she said, "what you told me the night we got engaged? At that restaurant on West Huron Street. I asked you what kind of life you wanted, and you said you didn't care where it happened or how it looked from the outside. You said the only thing that mattered was that it was real." Drew said nothing. "I believed that," she said. "I organized my entire life around the idea that you meant it." His attorney shifted. Stella looked at him steadily. He stopped shifting. "I also found the second phone," she said, 6 months ago. The room went quiet in a very specific way. "I read everything," she said, her voice entirely level, "including the email thread between you and Warren Tennyson's project director. The one where you discussed terms for the firm restructure. You've been in merger conversations with the Tennyson Group for 8 months, Drew, and his daughter has been in your life for 7. Drew's jaw tightened. "Stella, how much are the Tennyson contracts worth to your firm?" she asked. "Approximately." The financial advisor made a sound. Lorraine made a different sound. Drew's face had gone very still. "I'm not saying any of this to humiliate you," Stella said. "I'm saying it so that when I signed these papers, you understand exactly what I know, so that this moment is honest, even if nothing else has been." She picked up the pen. She signed her name. The room felt different after, like something in the air pressure had shifted. Stella stood and adjusted her coat. Drew was staring at her signature on the page. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its professional architecture. Something underneath it was exposed that she hadn't heard from him in a very long time. "That's it," he said. "That's it," she said. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. "Stella." His voice stopped her, not commanding, not the boardroom voice, something quieter, something that sounded almost unguarded. "Where are you going?" She looked back over her shoulder. "I have a meeting." "You don't have." He stopped himself then. "You gave up your work when we got married." The first and only smile of the morning crossed her face. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't triumphant. It was the particular smile of someone who has been holding a secret for a very long time and has finally decided they no longer need to. "I said I had a meeting," she said. "I didn't say where." And then Drew's financial advisor, whose name was Carl, said from across the room in a voice that was entirely unlike his previous voice, "Drew." Drew turned. Carl was holding his phone screen out so the room could see it. A financial alert notification. The automated kind that went to anyone monitoring a company's corporate filings. Harmon Medical Holdings, board transition filing confirmed. Stella Louise Harmon named executive director and sole controlling authority, effective immediately. Lorraine leaned forward to read it. Drew read it twice. "What is Harmon Medical Holdings?" his attorney said slowly. Stella was already at the door. It was Carl who answered, in the voice of a man doing arithmetic in real time and not liking where the numbers were landing. "It's a private healthcare network. Hospitals, clinics, pharmaceutical supply chains, long-term care facilities across the Southeast and Midwest. The consolidated asset value of Harmon Medical Holdings is..." He stopped, looked up. His face was a color it had not been 30 seconds ago. "Drew, it's $940 billion. The number landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Lorraine sat down. Drew didn't sit. He stood exactly where he was with an expression Stella had never seen on him. The face of a man whose entire map of the past 4 years had just been replaced by a completely different map, and he was still standing there, holding the old one. "Drew," Stella's voice was entirely steady, "keep the $75,000. She walked out. In the elevator, she let out one slow breath. James was waiting in the lobby. 63 years old, silver-haired, carrying a slim leather folder, and when he saw her come through the glass doors, he simply opened the car door without a word, which was the most James Alderton thing he had ever done. She got in. "How was it?" he said. She looked out the window at the gray November street. It was exactly what it needed to be. "Are you all right?" She thought about it honestly. "I will be. I've been grieving this for a long time. Today was just the end of the grieving." James opened his folder. "The full board convenes at noon, and the Mercy West Clinic acquisition. The proposal is ready when you are." "We move on it Friday," she said. "The staff retention clause is solid. Move forward." He made a note. "Then there's something else." He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was being careful. "One of Drew's firm's contracts, the Bridgeport Community Center renovation, it was partially underwritten by a Harmon subsidiary. A community development fund your grandfather established in 2011. Drew Vance has been unknowingly receiving project support from your family's foundation for 14 months. Stella turned from the window. She thought about Drew, sitting on the kitchen floor at midnight with his back against the cabinet, afraid his company was going to collapse. She thought about the tea she brought him, about sitting beside him in the dark without saying a word, because she understood that what he needed wasn't a solution. It was someone willing to stay inside the fear with him. She had done that. She had also, somewhere in the background of all of it, made sure his company didn't fail, not because she'd planned it, because a foundation she had inherited looked at a community renovation project in Bridgeport and determined It was worth funding. It had been worth funding. It had nothing to do with Drew. It had everything to do with who she was. "Don't tell him," she said. James looked at her. "Stella." "He didn't earn it by knowing me," she said quietly. "He earned it by doing good work. Those are separate things. Leave it as it is." He wrote something down. He did not argue. He had known her too long to argue when her mind was entirely made up. Outside, Chicago moved past the tinted windows. She had walked these streets for 4 years, feeling like they belonged to a version of her life she was only visiting. She had made herself peripheral in rooms where she was, technically, the most significant person present. She had done it willingly, because she had wanted to be chosen for the right reasons. She had wanted to know whether what they had was real. Now she knew. Back in the conference room on the 31st floor, Drew Vance sat in the chair Stella had been sitting in. Not his own chair at the head of the table, hers. He pressed his hands flat against the glass and he tried to reconstruct every conversation he'd ever had with her about her family. She'd told him her parents died when she was 11. She'd told him her grandfather raised her, a private man who didn't like publicity. She told him the man died the year before they met, and she'd cried when she talked about him, and Drew had held her hand and then shifted the conversation to the Bridgeport contract, because grief made him uncomfortable and he was better at being useful than at sitting inside someone else's pain. He'd held her hand, he'd moved on. He'd done that with everything she ever offered him. His phone was ringing. He didn't answer. Carl had left. The attorney had left. Lorraine was standing at the window with her back to him. "How long have you known?" he said. She didn't turn around. "Mom." "I received information," Lorraine said carefully, "approximately 2 years ago. A colleague recognized the Harmon name at a foundation event." Drew went very still. "You knew for 2 years," he said, his voice flat and controlled in the way it got when the thing he was feeling was too large for the room. "You sat at dinners with her. You said things to her, Lorraine. Deliberately. You knew who she was and you." "I didn't know the full extent." "You knew enough," he said. "You knew she wasn't who you'd been telling everyone she was. And you said nothing." Lorraine turned from the window. Something had shifted in her expression. Something she almost never showed. "I said nothing, because I thought if you knew you would stay. For the wrong reasons, and she would know, and I." Her voice caught on the last word in a way it almost never did. "I thought you would figure it out on your own. I thought you would look at her. Really, look at her, and you would understand what you had before it was gone." Drew looked at the divorce papers. At Stella's signature, unhurried and completely sure of itself. He had seen that signature on grocery lists, on birthday cards. He had never once thought to look it up. He had never once asked. Stella's phone rang at 6:48 the following morning. She was already at her desk in the Harmon Medical Holdings offices in River North. A building that most people passed every day without knowing what it was. Her grandfather had built it that way deliberately. No exterior signage, no corporate branding visible from the street, just a clean facade in dark granite and a single set of glass doors, and above them a small circular seal she had grown up looking at on his desk, on his stationery, on the back of the pocket watch he carried every day until he died. She answered without checking the number. "Stella." Drew's voice was different than she had heard it before. The professional architecture of it was gone. "I know I don't have any right to call you." "You don't," she said, "but you're calling anyway." Carl found the connection in the foundation records, the Bridgeport Fund. A pause. "You didn't tell me." "No." "Why?" She looked out the window at the early morning city. "Because you would have felt like you owed me something," she said. "And I didn't want that. I wanted what we had to be freely chosen. On its own terms." A long silence on the other end. "I need to ask you something," he said. "About Brooke." "I know what you're going to ask." "Her father introduced us," Drew said. "I thought it was a business opportunity. I didn't understand." "I have documentation," she said, "suggesting that Warren Tennyson's interest in your firm has almost nothing to do with your work, and almost everything to do with a federal infrastructure contract your company holds that his organization has been unable to access for 2 years. A personal relationship was a cleaner pathway than a formal acquisition review. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she checked whether the call had dropped. She knew, he said finally. I think Brooke Tennyson is more complicated than simply being her father's instrument, Stella said, carefully. But that is not something I am going to weigh in on. It is not my story to tell. Stella. His voice had gone rough, in a way she recognized, the sound of someone who has finally stopped performing. I'm sorry. Not because your name is in the financial filings, not because I look like a fool, because you were the best person I have ever known, and I treated you like a problem I had already solved. She held the phone and let the words settle in the room. I believe that you mean that, she said. Right now, in this moment, I believe it. But meaning something after the damage is done is not the same as doing something when it would have counted. She paused. I'm not saying that to punish you, Drew. I'm saying it because I think you need to hear it clearly, without softening. He didn't answer immediately, then very quietly, I know. Your firm is going to be all right, she said. I have no interest in destabilizing 500 jobs because of what happened between us. What happens at the executive level is a governance matter. The foundation's interest is in the work itself, not the crisis. A pause. You're protecting it, he said slowly. Even now you're protecting it. I'm protecting the people who work there, she said. That's different. She heard him exhale. Can I ask you one more thing? Ask. Was there ever a moment, in 4 years, where you almost told me the truth? About the foundation, about who you actually were? Stella set her pen down. Once, she said. You came home from a contractor meeting and sat down on the kitchen floor with your back against the cabinet and told me you didn't know if you could keep going, and I sat down next to you. And I thought, I could make one call right now. I could remove this fear for you completely. She paused. But I didn't, because you needed to solve it yourself, and because if I solved it by revealing who I was, we would never know if what we had was real or just relief. The silence that followed was the longest of the conversation. It was real, he said. In the beginning, it was real. I got afraid of something I couldn't name, and I found ways to make it your fault instead of mine. Stella looked out the window. I know, she said. Is there any version? He stopped, started again. Any version of a future where? No, she said, not unkindly, immediately but not unkindly. He exhaled. I knew before I asked. Then why ask? Because I needed to hear it without any ambiguity, he said, so I couldn't hold on to a version of maybe. She almost smiled. Do something honest with what you build next, she said. She ended the call. She sat with the quiet for exactly 1 minute. Then she opened the Mercy West acquisition file and she kept working. 3 weeks later, Stella Harmon stood at a podium at the National Healthcare Access Summit in Washington, D.C., and spoke for 34 minutes to a room of 1,400 people and an online audience. Her communications director told her, afterward exceeded 2 million viewers. She wore a dark navy suit, a single pin on her lapel, the Harmon Medical Holdings seal, small and circular, which her grandfather had worn every day of his professional life and which she had not worn in 4 years. She pinned it on that morning in her hotel room and looked at herself in the mirror for 15 seconds. Then she picked up her bag and walked out. She spoke about what the Harmon Foundation was building, a network of community health clinics in medically underserved counties across 12 states, free primary care, subsidized prescriptions, a mobile diagnostic program for rural areas where the nearest hospital was 40 miles away. She named a woman in rural Tennessee who had been managing a chronic illness without consistent care for 6 years before a Harmon clinic opened in her county. She named a retired school teacher in Mississippi who had her first mammogram at 68 because the foundation's mobile unit came to her town. She did not read from notes. She knew these names because she had visited these places, quietly, in the 4 years she'd spent inside her marriage doing the work she couldn't yet claim publicly. Near the end of the press conference, a journalist asked what she wanted people to take from her story. Stella looked at the camera for a moment before answering. "I spent 4 years making myself smaller," she said, "because I thought it would protect something that was worth protecting." She paused. It didn't. The only thing that protected me was knowing who I was underneath all of it. And what freed me was finally choosing to be that person completely, regardless of whether anyone in the room was ready for it. She looked directly into the lens. If you are watching this and you have been making yourself invisible for someone who refuses to see you, I want you to hear me clearly. The cost of that invisibility is paid entirely by you. You do not have to keep paying it. The room stood. All 1,400 people at once. She stood at the podium and accepted it without performance. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't smile the wide-open smile of someone feeding on a moment. She simply stood with her hands at her sides and her grandfather's seal on her lapel, and she let it happen around her. The way he used to stand in exactly this kind of moment, spine straight, face present, as if to say, "I hear you. I will not forget this. Now let's get to work." In a rented office on North Clark Street, in a building nobody would ever photograph for a magazine, Drew Vance was at a drafting table at 7 a.m. doing work that no one had asked him to publicize. He had started a small nonprofit 2 weeks after the summit coverage ran, pro bono architectural design for community organizations that couldn't afford renovation. Food banks, after-school programs, clinics in neighborhoods where the infrastructure had been quietly falling apart for decades. He'd called it groundwork. He hadn't issued a press release. He hadn't posted about it. He'd called his oldest friend, Paul, who taught 8th grade in Pilsen, and who had known Drew since they were 15, and he'd told Paul everything. Not the managed version. Not the version prepared for a legal deposition, the true one. And Paul had listened without offering perspective, and then gotten up and made 2 cups of regular coffee from a regular maker and set one in front of Drew and said simply, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," Drew said. "That's probably honest," Paul said. Drew drank the coffee. It wasn't good coffee. It was fine. He drank it, and he thought about a woman who had brought him tea at midnight and sat on a kitchen floor beside him, and never once made him feel like his fear was an inconvenience. He thought about her signature on the divorce papers, steady, unhurried, sure of itself. He thought about the community center he was designing in Humboldt Park, about the school library in Englewood, 3 weeks from breaking ground, that existed at 29, sitting in a small restaurant, telling a woman he'd just met that all he wanted was something real. That version of himself had been telling the truth. He had lost track of it for a long time. He was finding his way back. On the morning of the International Medical Innovation Forum, 8 months after the day she signed her name without her hand, shaking and walked out of a room that had measured her worth at $75,000, Stella Harmon stood backstage in Geneva and pinned her grandfather's seal to her lapel. She thought about the pen she had used to sign the divorce papers. A plain black pen, the kind you find in a desk drawer and forget about until the moment you actually need it. She had kept it, not as a trophy, not as proof of anything. She kept it because it was the pen she had been holding on the morning she chose herself, not the morning the world learned her name, not the morning the foundation's assets appeared in a press filing, but the morning she sat across from a man who had spent 4 years deciding she was ordinary, and signed her name without flinching and walked out into whatever came next without looking back. That was the morning worth keeping. She walked out onto the stage. 3,000 people rose before she reached the podium. She walked to the microphone and placed her hands on the edges of the podium and looked out at the room. The researchers, the policymakers, the physicians, the millions watching on screens in countries she had never visited, and she felt the full weight of everything she carried and the complete clarity of knowing exactly what she intended to do with it. She had not come back to prove something to anyone who had underestimated her. She had come back because the work needed doing. And Stella Harmon, the woman they had called too quiet, the wife they had called unremarkable, the heir no one had expected to return, opened her mouth and built something that would last far longer than anyone's opinion of her ever had.